A Capitol police officer was killed over the weekend by a man who rammed his car through a security barrier. That attack brought more attention to the ongoing debate over the necessity for heightened security around the U.S. Capitol following, of course, the January 6th insurrection. Our next guest weighed in on the debate, saying, quote, exploiting a tragedy like the one this week is just that. It's not a logical defense of the National Guard presence or new fencing.
Joining us now to discuss, friend of the show, Zaid Jilani. Zaid, I wanted to have you speak about this because really was an egregious media situation. At the beginning of the attack, there was all this, oh, look, more white supremacist terror. This is why we need the National Guard, all of this. Then it comes out that the person who was the attacker may have had some mental illness problems, apparently was a follower of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. No clue whether that had anything to do with the motivation of the attack, and then silence, oh, no, the thing just never happened. Just go into that dynamic about everybody trying to politicize this, when the truth is it just shows that, yeah, there's some crazy people that sometimes go after the Capitol building.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll see this once or twice a year. There will be somebody who does something similar to this at the Capitol or the White House. Usually someone tries to jump the fence or someone tries to get into Congress. And that's why we generally secure these places very well. I mean, the Capitol Police have, I think, something like 2,300 staff, right? And that's staffing for, I don't know, for 4 or 5 blocks, right, of D.C. It must be one of the most well-equipped police departments in America per capita or per block, really. And I think that's why we have the security that we do have. Now, the question is, a number of folks had suggested that this proved, as you suggested, they had said this proves that we need to have a robust National Guard presence, that we need a large exterior fencing, so on and so forth. If you go to the U.S. Capitol, you'll see that they have, they already have defenses set up against cars. Right? They block cars that aren't basically belonging to members of Congress or otherwise staff. And they have a robust police presence. And those are the people who dealt with this attack, actually, right? There was a police officer who lost his life. I believe there was another one who was injured. And his car was basically blocked by a roadblock that I believe, was pre-existing prior to January 6th or prior to the new security measures. So there's really no evidence that this wouldn't have been stopped prior to all those new security measures. And again, I think it was back in around 2013 or something very similar, where there was a woman who had kind of lost her mind. She drove from the White House type area to the Capitol.
That's right.
She ended up crashing in the Capitol, and then she was shot dead by the Capitol Police. So actually, this very similar sorts of incidents have occurred in the past. And I think when they had occurred in the past, nobody suggested increasing security or establishing new measures because, quite frankly, what already exists was more than adequate. I think that's really the question. It's like, should you overreact to incidents like this? And I think to many people, it brought up memories of January 6th. As you mentioned, they had that immediate reaction. But that was, a riot with several hundred people. And even in that case, it seems like if the Capitol Police, it may have been more of a logistical failure on their part, not necessarily a resources failure, right? I think that they had certain capacities that they just didn't deploy because of failures up and down the leadership chain, but it wasn't necessarily that they needed to have National Guard on hand. I mean, National Guard were on hand this last week. They didn't really do anything. They didn't really have any role, right? I think they just went and patrolled afterwards or something. Those are people who are being pulled away from their families in the States and have been for quite some time. And, I think there is a legitimate question about what the actual need is for them. There's other things the National Guard could be doing in the country. So,
Well, and Zaid, what would you say to people who say, okay, sure, but hey, what's the harm in having some extra layers of security? We've got heightened tensions now. We saw what happened in January 6th. Why not keep a fence up, throw in some extra National Guard troops, make sure everything's good to go?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One was the thing that I mentioned earlier, which was that National Guard are people basically who are they're not necessarily day-to-day career military, right? They have certain they have certain routines that they're called up to go through. Usually they're deployed in the case of a natural disaster or an emergency event. They're also being used, for instance, for COVID deployment. Some states like West Virginia has made very liberal use of National Guard for that purpose. So they're generally seen under that kind of mandate, right? They're not really supposed to be used as like police, right? They're not. It's not the same way a Capitol Police officer has a job day in, day out. They tend to have their family in that area, in the DC, DMV area, so on and so forth. These are people who are being called up from all parts of the country So one, we have to think about them. If they're not necessary, it's kind of an inconvenience for them and their families. And the second is that this is a symbol of democracy for us, right? The U.S. Capitol. If we have large fences around it, if we have people dressed in military gear around it, it sends a certain message that we're afraid that if anyone tries to cause any trouble, this is how we end up gearing up and responding, right? As if we are, we're living in fear of another riot or a terrorist threat or so on and so forth. And I think there's a question of like, do we want to send that message to the world that we are that fearful of our own population, right? I think after 9/11, something people may notice is that the White House fence has gotten further and further out. Prior to 9/11, you could actually get very close to the White House. Now it's very far out. Now it's hard to even get into that park, I think Lafayette, because there's so much fencing around the White House given riots in last year that happened last summer. And it is kind of sending a message that our government's very fragile, that we're very fragile, that we're very scared. And I think there's a lot of people, even Eleanor Nomes Horton, who's a Democratic congresswoman for D.C., actually wrote an op-ed in National Review, a right-wing
That's right.
magazine.
We had her on the show too. Yeah.
Right. Suggesting that she objected to this as a resident of D.C. because she doesn't want to see her city, her hometown, subjected to these measures if they're not absolutely necessary. So I think we had to think about all these costs before we end up deploying these kind of resources for too long. So
exactly right. And I think the most disturbing part to me, Zed, was the appearance for a couple hours before anybody knew who it was full bore, the terror and all of that, all this justification of the security. Then when people found out who it was, then that was withdrawn. And then you saw right-wingers, come in and rejoice that it was actually like a Muslim guy and actually see, this is what it really is. And it just goes to show that this is all hyper-politicized of our security state, weaponized against people. And it just seems nobody ever seems to learn the lesson. It will always come for you, is that there will always be some justification in order to use it against you in a convenient time. And that's exactly what happened. And it was almost funny to see it happen with so much certainty so quickly as a result of learning these facts.
Yeah, I think that something that's very key to understand is that in terms of our bigger security situation in the United States, we don't actually face a lot of threats like this. They're out there. There'll always be someone out there, like the people on January 6th, like the baseball shooter, like the attacker last week. Those people exist, but we have resources to deal with that. We have police, we have the FBI, we have DHS, and they do a reasonable job of protecting us from those people. It's very, very rare to see an event like this. You may see it once or twice a year. Some kind of political extremist, appears and tries to do something. But we're very well resourced to deal with them. So the question is it really worth us worrying ourselves to death over it and overreacting and sending thousands of people away from their families to patrol as if there's an actual war going on or a natural disaster going on in DC? Because there isn't, right? There's always going to be a few criminals and extremists out there, and we are. I don't think anyone could argue the United States spends too little money on dealing with terrorism or dealing with those kinds of threats. We have plenty of resources at our disposal, so we should resist the knee-jerk reactions, I think, that we've been seeing. So
Yeah, it's so disgusting in those hours immediately after a horrific attack like this, where everyone's just waiting to see the shade of the skin color of the perpetrator to see if it's going to be useful for their talking point and their political side. It really is gross to watch that all unfold. Zed, thank you for breaking down the risks here. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate it, man.
Thanks. Bye.
Next on Rising, Reverend Dr. William Barber joins us to discuss the unique way his Poor People's Campaign is calling for an end to the filibuster and the continued fight for the minimum wage hike when Rising returns.